I am so pleased to bring to you today Mr. Len Colodny, and so you guys can get some share of his wisdom. I mean, this guy has been fighting for us, okay, for quite a while, you know. And, he got sued and all kinds of other things for writing the truth. And, you know, I am just ecstatic over being this gentleman's publisher. I mean, golly Wally, I remember when I came across his first book, Silent Coup, I said, wow, somebody's telling the truth, because I was searching and searching for it, and I just loved the book. And then he called me up and says, you know, let's put it out again. And I said, yes. And then he told me he had this other book called 40 Years War. And I had never even heard of it. And he sent it to me, and I read it, and I said, wow. And then I come to find out that the publisher that had it before basically stuffed it. Okay, they cut the orders, they cut the PR and everything, and which is sad for America. Okay, but we've got the book out now. I strongly recommend reading it. It is some of the best history and some of the most sourced history. I mean, Len, well, there's not much I can say. I'm just going to
Thank you.
Go.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to be in. Can you hear me? Okay, is that better? I may have to put it down my throat. Hold on. It's good to be here at this conference. This is a subject that I've been involved with now for more than 50-some years. I started out just a brief bio. 1958, I joined the campaign to make John F. Kennedy President of the United States through the primary system. In 1960, I worked in the campaign and believed in John F. Kennedy and everything that he was telling us. He told us about where he was going to take us, to the new frontier, and there was a whole lot of good things in the new frontier. It came as a real shock. November 22nd, 1963, and I remember I was with my dad at a restaurant called Kosher Corner in Silver Spring, Maryland, and the news came forth, not that he'd been killed, but he'd been shot. And I said, Dad, I've got to go home. I've got to go home. I've got to go to my wife, Sandy, and turn the television on. I want to know what's going on. That death had a great effect on me. Our next child was going to be born in a few months, and he's named John, after John F. Kennedy. I was so disturbed when the Warren Commission report came out that it didn't make sense. There were things in there that just politically, from having been in politics, even the limited number of years that I was there, that I just didn't buy. And I started to research it and talk about it. And I got together with the other experts on a number of television shows. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? That first picture, the man on the outside is Mark Lane. Mark Lane wrote the book Rush to Judgment. It was the first real attack on the Warren Commission. And I was paired with Mark on a television show in Washington on a channel called WFAN. It was called the John Hightower Show. And it ran for 3 or 4 hours. We just talked about what's wrong and theories and all of that. The second picture is myself with Jack Anderson, the columnist who went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. And finally, this last picture, which is a Polaroid, is taken by myself, so I'm not in the picture. But there's Jack Anderson, there's Harold Weisberg, another expert on the subject, along with Mark Lane and John Hightower. And if you look at the date on it, June 6, 1968, that night Bobby Kennedy was shot and, of course, died. So that's my beginning experience in investigating and trying to understand exactly what happened in JFK. And that went on for a number of years, but I sort of hit a dead end and went about as far as I could take it. Others were coming in, different theories, and I'm sure you're all acquainted with them. I started to research the Nixon-Watergate thing in the 1980s. And I learned that there isn't much difference between an assassination and a coup. At the end, both presidents were gone. We do look at the assassination quite differently than we look at the coup, because Nixon's a bad guy and he didn't go out in a coup. He went out over some break-in. But in silent coup, we called it silent coup for a reason. Silent coup was a coup. And what I learned in doing it, there were comparisons between the forces that were opposed to JFK and the forces that were opposed to Richard Nixon. There's a difference, though. And the difference is this. Kennedy talked openly about certain peace initiatives, about nuclear weapons and trying to ban them. Nixon took the secret road and tried to do it all in secret, cutting the national security apparatus out. And to explain how that happened, you have to go to the first day that Richard Nixon was sworn in as president. And he said he'd uphold the laws of the United States. And then he went back to the White House and he signed a document called NSDM-2. And what NSDM-2 did was take the power away from the State Department, the Defense Department, and the CIA and deposit it in the Oval Office. It was called the National Security Council, and it was supposedly headed by Henry Kissinger. Nixon used that secret government to make his deals with China and to make his deals with the Soviet Union. And before the establishment knew it, these deals were made. You remember the secrecy. Henry Kissinger pops up in China, and so on. And what Nixon was doing, in some ways, was implementing what Kennedy wanted, that these forces opposed. It was the military, the intelligence community, who did not agree with where the president was going. And worse than that, we were fighting a war in Vietnam. And the war in Vietnam became a bargaining chip for Nixon. He bled us out of Vietnam. He basically could have gotten the same deal in 1969 that he ended up in 1972. The difference is that in 1972 he had completed the mission of opening to China and cutting deals on nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union. So those forces then, in my mind, said, wait a minute, what's going on here? What is the connection? Or is there even a connection? So I went and looked at what was happening. The military was very disturbed at the highest levels of our military that Nixon was reducing our forces in Vietnam and calling it Vietnamization and not telling the military what he was doing. They had no idea what his strategy was, where he was going with it. And in essence, what would happen is they felt locked out. So in 1969, when all this starts, about 6 months into the Nixon presidency, a fellow you might have heard of Bob Woodward. Everybody heard of Bob Woodward, the Washington Post, all the president's men? Well, did you know that Bob Woodward worked in the Nixon White House? How many here knew that Bob Woodward worked in the Nixon White House? Not a lot, hardly any. And what Bob Woodward did, he manned a secret back channel in the Pentagon. Back channel went around the Pentagon, went around the State Department, went around the CIA. He would take the messages from the secret back channel to the White House, and he would brief Alexander Haig. Now, this is a story you've never heard before, because he doesn't want you to know this. He wants to be perceived as this young, go-get-'em reporter who managed to bring Richard Nixon down. So we interviewed, for Silent Coup, we interviewed Bob Woodward in his house. We were in his kitchen, and he had 3 tape recorders rolling, and he's going to, for an hour and a half, he was going to answer my partner, Bob Getlin, and my questions. The question that we cared about most was, did you brief Alexander Haig? And so Woodward took a very strong position. So you can listen here where we ask him about it and what his answer was.
During that year, did you, as when you were working at the Pentagon, you mentioned you were a communications watch officer. Did you have any other job, any other function? Nothing. Did you do any briefings of people? Never. Never did you?
I defy you to produce somebody who says, I did a briefing. It's not true.
It's not true. I didn't brief anybody. Forget about Alexander Haig. I never briefed anybody. So next on our list was to go to his boss, Admiral Thomas Moore, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with our same question. Back to Woodward. All right, now you can listen to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Tom Moore, ask the question. That's a pretty clear answer. Admiral Moore said, I sent Bob Woodward to brief Alexander Haig because I needed to communicate with the president and so forth. So now we have one person, only the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and what the chairman didn't know was my partner was secretly tape recording the interview. We had that interview in our pocket when we went to sell Silent Coup. But we didn't stop there. We said, well, let's go to Moore's boss. And so Bob went to interview Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird. And again, we secretly tape recorded the conversation. And
Are you saying that you weren't aware at the time, though, that he was briefing Haig? Is that what you're saying, or you were aware? I was aware that Haig was being briefed by Woodward. Yeah, you were. At the time that he was over there at the Pentagon. Okay. Yeah, on temporary assignment. For a year, I think he was there. He was there for a temporary assignment.
well, that's 2 for 2. This is recordings that the Washington Post does not want you to hear, the establishment does not want you to hear, because if we're right and if these men are telling the truth, everything we know about Watergate is wrong. The history was written by this man who was a secret insider, briefed Alexander Haig, did not need a man in a garage that he would later call Deep Throat, who he met secretly. He would just pick the phone up and say, Al, it's Bob. Remember, I used to brief you. I'm now at the Post. Of course, that's what he'd do. It changes everything we know about Watergate. The military, the bosses that I just presented to you, felt that they needed to steal Nixon's secrets in order to know what the heck was going on. And so a military spy ring was formed inside the White House, headed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The gentleman you see on the left is W. Donald Stewart. W. Donald Stewart investigated the spy ring, the chief investigator, for the Pentagon. And this is what Don Stewart had to say on day one after he saw some of the evidence. Not all of the evidence, but some of the evidence.
Absolutely stunned. Absolutely stunned. And I later, when I went home and told my wife, I said, you know, honest to God, this to me is the 7 days, the real life 7 days in May, where the military are trying to overthrow the president.
And that was true. That's what he saw. But it wasn't quite overthrow the president. It was to figure out what he was doing. And this is the way they set it up. You remember that little National Security Council that Woodward, that Nixon used to put all his powers in? Well, he pierced that. There was a naval lieutenant or captain who would be there. It would be a liaison to the National Security Council. Well, that person would be part of the spy ring. The person telling them what to steal would be Alexander Haig. And the gentleman that was doing the pilfering and giving it to the captain to take to Admiral Moore would be Yeoman Radford. Yeoman Radford stole material, went to burn bags, and did all those things. He, too, said the purpose was to overthrow the President of the United States. I think both men overstated where the military was at the time, but clearly something's wrong when they're stealing documents out of burn bags and out of other places and taking them to the Pentagon because they'd never seen them before. This was a very important operation. The middle person at the time that Nixon found out about it was an Admiral Wellender. Admiral Wellender, very tight with Admiral Moore, but more interesting in a way. He was commander of the USS Fox before he came there, and guess who was on there as his lieutenant? Bob Woodward. Now Bob Woodward is connected into the military spy ring through his relationship not only to Alexander Haig, but his relationship to Admiral Wellender. So now you have Admiral Moore is his boss, Admiral Wellender used to be his boss, and he briefed Al Haig. And now the pieces of the puzzle, for me, were beginning to come together. I had now seen actual proof and heard actual proof that what we were told, the fairy tale we were sold in All the President's Men, was just that, a fairy tale. Not the truth, not even close. And we were all looking in the wrong direction. We spent the better part of 3 decades guessing who Deep Throat was. Something that did not even exist. I interviewed people about Deep Throat, and then I went and read All the President's Men, and I did it before I went to Woodward's house to interview him. I think we have it up here, the Woodward, the Deep Throat connection, Deep Throat. And we asked Bob Woodward, myself, reading him from his own book, he had said that Deep Throat was a confirming source. He was never the guy that came there and told anything. He would be there for Woodward. They'd have signals and they would meet, and he would confirm what Woodward had found. Well, this is what happened when I read that part of his book to himself. To Bob Woodward.
I just have some confusion, or maybe you could clear the confusion better than anyone else. I was trying to understand the agreement that you had with your source, not who the source is. I'm not asking who the source is, and I don't want to get involved in. That's not what this book is about. I'm not trying to find out who your source was. The game has been played so many times, you almost get tired of reading stories about who he is and Dean's elaborate attempt to figure out exactly who the person is. But I am interested in the agreement that you had with your source. And according to all the president's men, he said that you said that you had promised him you would never identify him or his position to anyone. And further, you agreed never to quote the man, even as an anonymous source, and that the discussions would only confirm information that had been obtained elsewhere and to add some perspective. Is that essentially?
Evidence in the book.
I know, I'm asking you, is that essentially?
That's what the book says.
You made the agreement, so I figured you might, and wrote the book, so I assume that that's correct.
Go ahead, what's the question?
All right. What I don't understand, you can help me understand that. Well, listen, you're well read. 2 out of 3 isn't bad, right?
It's a library, and you didn't even buy it.
Well, I can't afford it. Listen, I've got a store-bought as ever, the always observant Woodward, right? In the story about in the November meeting that you had with your source, in which
November when?
1973, which is probably based on the last meeting that took place, and which you said Throat's message was short and simple. One or more of the tapes contained deliberate erasures. You described the meeting as occurring the first week in November 1973. There's no date on it, but that's definitely it. It seems to me there's some confusion between the agreement and whether he confirmed information. And you could tell me how it squares with the agreement. I don't quite understand. If all he's doing is confirming information you have, this is clearly information that only he had.
What do you mean clearly information only he had?
You didn't come to him and say, I know about tapes being erased in the White House. And the word that jumps out at you is deliberate, because if somebody's deliberately erasing tapes that are before Judge Sirica, we're talking about a crime. We're not talking about just any piece of information.
Or otherwise, it's evolving, and I think it got to the point where there was sufficient concern on his part that he told you.
So, in fact, all we're trying to establish is that the relationship, as you wrote earlier in the book, about he would only confirm, didn't stay that way. It changed. So
book makes it clear.
It evolved. But there's no statement of the evolution. It just evolved.
Well,
So, I mean, I've read the book. There's no statement by you that somehow...
There's nothing inconsistent with that. The facts are laid out as they occurred over time.
Okay. You've heard Woodward being asked the question about his secret source that he said and wrote and in the movie was just some guy out here that Woodward got a piece of information and all he did was confirm it. Nonsense. Woodward got caught because the tape erasure, as he wrote it, was deliberate. That meant that his source either erased the tape or knows who erased the tape. And he clearly understood that was what was being put on the table for him. And so now he just said it evolved. The throat couldn't take it anymore. Well, I think you will find that Woodward knew exactly who erased those. Actually, 13 and a half minutes, 5 had already been erased by Rosemary Woods. So you get a pretty good idea of who's connected to who's doing what to who in the Nixon White House. In December of 1971, an article appeared in Jack Anderson's column. It used to be a column in the back of the Washington Post. It used to have a comic strip page, but very serious political column. And you remember Jack Anderson, the guy I sat next to? It's his writing of that, a specific event that took place in the Indian Ocean that led to the discovery by the President of the United States that there had been a spy ring and who was in it. December of 1971. And there were a number of things into that investigation. The President of the United States on December 22nd, 1971, and you can hear the tape on the website, but I'm not going to do it right now. The President wants to prosecute Admiral Moore and his friends. And the Attorney General, John Mitchell, says to him, not now. You're not going into court. You're in the middle of a war. There's an election coming up. How about you paper it over? And the next morning, the President of the United States wrote a note to a young man named David Young, who worked for John Ehrlichman, who was the aide to Nixon, the domestic aide. Young was a Kissinger aide. And he got this note, don't do anymore. But the next day, Admiral Wellender was due to come in and be questioned by John Ehrlichman and by David Young. I will show you the confession right here. This is still classified. You cannot get this out of the United States government anywhere at this time. John Ehrlichman went in and got it for me. It was in his files. And he convinced the chief archivist to let him take this document out. This is the original document where Admiral Wellender confesses to the spy ring and who was in it. But he says something that's really very important. He says the key guy in the White House is Alexander Haig. That's really going to become a critical part of what's going on here. Because the President of the United States has said, I don't want to hear any more about this. I want this thing closed down. Young is just a 30-year-old national security guy. He was a Kissinger guy, and now he's at odds with Haig. And Richard Nixon never finds out that Alexander Haig was a key player in the spy ring operating against him. So when he papers it over, it all gets papered over. But this doesn't get papered over. We got it. It's in Silent Coup. It's on the website. And it's a very important document. And there are people today trying to get that document out. Why is that going to be so important? Well, it's going to be so important because down the road, Watergate happens. And if you don't mind, I'll put Watergate a little bit over here for a minute and tell you that at the worst time for President Nixon, he has to fire his two chief aides, Bob Haldeman, who was his chief of staff, and John Ehrlichman. And by the way, John Dean, you can resign. I'm going to say nice things about you as I'm going to say about Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And he has to make a decision. Who is going to replace Bob Haldeman as Nixon's chief of staff? I mean, the man is being battered. I mean, this is really bad. He needs somebody that's going to come in and protect him. He's going to need that person savvy enough to know how to get him through this horrible period in front, maneuver through what was going on in Watergate. He wants to hire John Connally, the former governor of Texas, and who was, as you know, shot on the same day with JFK. Nixon and Connally had become very tight. He had tremendous trust in Connally. He liked strong men like John Mitchell and like John Connally. And Bob Haldeman says to him, "You can't do that. He's not the man for you. You need somebody that knows this administration inside and out." He says, "I think you should hire Alexander Haig." The president thinks about it. Chuck Colson, another aide of Nixon of dirty tricks fame, Chuck Colson comes to the president, and he too is a fan of Alexander Haig. And so the President of the United States hires the man to protect him who was the key member of the spy ring, Alexander Haig. You know the end isn't very nice. It's Alexander Haig maneuvering Nixon out the door, one step at a time. And in the end, when he did it, when he finally got Nixon out and got a deal with Ford for a pardon, Woodward wrote Final Days, in which Alexander Haig is the hero of Watergate, that he saves the country from this horrible event. You can now see this wasn't about a break-in. This was a policy fight. This was a policy fight over China, a policy fight over the Soviet Union, a policy fight over Nixon's secrecy. That's what this was about. And his enemies, the people who want to do him in, are going to use Watergate as the excuse. Folks, that's not true. It's the reason was what I stated. Nixon did not get away with creating a secret government. Nixon did not. Well, he did implement his policies. He did open to China. They could not stop the treaty with the Soviet Union. They all came in place. But at the end of the day, Nixon left. And just like JFK, he was gone. And he was gone. He wasn't impeached. He didn't go on trial in the Senate, and he was never found guilty. And remember, this is the important part. The United States then had an unelected president and an unelected vice president. The first time in our history. And we're clueless. We've been sold a fairy tale as to how this all happens. And how important to know exactly what happened. Because it affects us today. Let me give you an example. Remember NSDM2? Oh, yep, they got rid of Richard Nixon. Barack Obama has all the powers that Richard Nixon took into the White House. He's got them all. He can take a drone tomorrow and he can kill somebody anywhere he wants. Now, the Congress was really concerned about Nixon going into Cambodia and so on. And they went ahead and they passed something called the War Powers Act. And what the War Powers Act said, Mr. President, if you invade a country, 60 days later, send me a letter telling us what you did and blah, 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 and then we'll vote as to whether you can go to war. Well, in August of last year, not this year, last year, Barack Obama sent them a letter complying with the War Powers Act. We have not seen a vote. Not one, a lot of bickering, but no vote. Our Constitution has been shredded on the issue of war. Congress has explicit power to conduct war, and Nixon undermined that part of the Constitution to achieve his goals. There's a lesson, because another group was forming to fight Richard Nixon and his foreign policy. And this was a group made of very conservative Republicans and what was then called Scoop Jackson Democrats. Scoop Jackson was a senator from Washington State who was very, very liberal on social issues and very, very conservative on foreign policy. And they believed in something they called peace through strength, which I deal with in great detail in 40 Years' War. Peace through strength has become our policy. We invaded Iraq because of the people who believed in that policy. So what happened to Richard Nixon didn't end with Richard Nixon leaving the White House. It didn't end with him being pardoned. It meant a huge change in our foreign policy. Peace through strength was a theory created by a fellow named Fritz Kramer, who was a mentor to both Haig and Kissinger. And the theory went this way. You never bargain except from strength. You never bargain at all unless you get everything you want, and if you don't, you put a bullet in their head. Just you go away. Iraq was part of that theory. In fact, Kramer, who was 95 years old, was brought to the Pentagon shortly before his death in 2003 to discuss it with Don Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense at the time. And when Rumsfeld left the Pentagon, a big story about it in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and that's what he talked about, peace through strength, the provocative weakness. It was the headline of him leaving. So it didn't end with Nixon. It didn't end with Watergate. It got worse, and it changed for all of us. This election shouldn't surprise anybody. This is a direction we've been headed in for decades now. And you have to look at this in the big picture. Silent coup gives you the basic foundation to understanding Watergate and John Dean's role in it and so on and so forth. But you go to 40 Years' War to understand the policy fight and to understand the birth of the neoconservatives. And we call them neoconservatives, but they didn't just start with Nixon. They were in one form or another before there was a Nixon, but they consolidated their power. And Ronald Reagan was the first real president that represented peace through strength and talked about peace through strength. And of course, who did he make his first Secretary of State? Alexander Haig. That was not an accident. And Alexander Haig, who convinced Nixon that he, Alexander Haig, had gotten him the pardon, wrote a lengthy letter to Ronald Reagan praising Al Haig and saying he should make him Secretary of State. The man that worked to get rid of him is now the man going to become our Secretary of State. And Haig knew that the power had shifted. And the first thing he said as Secretary of State is, I'm the vicar of foreign policy. He would later say, I'm in charge at the White House, and both were not true. Reagan understood, and his people understood, the power was in the White House. Haig, who was part of the invention of that power being in the White House and getting the president out, now wants all that power back as Secretary of State. And so he gets into an interpolitical war inside the Reagan administration, and it's determined that Al has to go. So the lesson here, and it's an important lesson, this minute, this second that we're here, we're affected by the removal of Richard Nixon, by the death of John F. Kennedy. Didn't start with Nixon, probably didn't start with Kennedy. I use policy, working back from who benefited from Nixon's demise, getting him out, and finding what I found, and saying the way to really deal with Kennedy is what changed, who benefited from John F. Kennedy's death. That I haven't had a chance to explore in the way I'm sure many people here have, but I think that's a way toward an answer that makes sense. Yes, there are great books about what happened in Dealey Plaza. My favorite book, the best book that I've ever read on the subject, was 6 Seconds in Dallas by Josiah Thompson. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It deals with that issue. So that kind of gives you an idea of where Silent Coup is. I will show you the Silent Coup page, and this is important to remember. when you buy Silent Coup, you get this for free. So you can actually sit and read Silent Coup, read documents as you read about documents, listen to people as you read about them. It makes Silent Coup a very unique book. We call these electronic evidence packages. So you want to hear Bob Woodward, you hear Bob Woodward. You want to hear John Dean, you hear John Dean. Really great thing that happened 2 years ago. Texas A&M University came to me and said, we want all your research. If you give us all your research, we will put that online, every bit of it, including a lawsuit from John Dean, which I won, will be available to you, to his future historians and to future journalists and future researchers like you guys who will do this kind of work. You're going to get the whole picture. And yes, there's an alternative theory, one with evidence against the fairy tales that were told by Bob Woodward and in Final Days by the story of Alexander Hay. These are fairy tales. They're made up. There was no Deep Throat. It's all garbage to distract you and to keep you from looking at what I've shown you today. Now you're going to say, you got this tape. Well, Silent Coup comes out. It's published. And the Washington Post runs an article about it on the style section, not the news section. Can't put it on the news section. Put it in the style section. And the style section has one target, that interview with Admiral Moore. They claim that Moore never talked to us, never heard from us. Well, Moore didn't know there was a tape. And the next day a tape was played, and Admiral Moore took back what he said to the Washington Post, confirmed that, yes, that's him, and yes, that's what he said. To this day, to this minute, to this second, the Washington Post has never retracted and printed what's on that tape. That is a very serious problem in this great journalistic story, because it wasn't a great journalistic story. On the Silent Coup page, we have a lot. I'll show you some of the inventory. We have a Silent Coup C-SPAN show that you can watch. It's an hour long, and it's with Brian Lamb, the original person who did C-SPAN book notes. In there you will see a review by The Nation. You'll read the foreword by Roger Morris. Silent Coup reviews. And then 6 months after Silent Coup was written, I go to my mailbox and there's a package. And I didn't think of it. I took it with the rest of the mail, went back to my house. It's about Christmas time. And I open it up, and there's a signed book by Richard Nixon, signed personally. What's going on here? Man wouldn't give me an interview. Wasn't worth the time I did. And suddenly, I open the mailbox, and there's a letter inside congratulating me on my long stay on the New York Times bestseller list, signed by Richard Nixon, RN. Yes, this was crazy. This was a crazy ride. And there's a time span between Silent Coup and 40 Years' War, because I didn't write 40 Years' War until 2009. So that's a good, healthy time to reflect on Silent Coup. And the way to read it, if you're going from the beginning, is you read Silent Coup first and read 40 Years' War second. Or if you care about today, you read 40 Years' War first and go back and see what happened later. So these are the things, the elements. There's much more on this page. There's tons of material. I would recommend that you read about John Dean. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him. He's not worth it. I interviewed John Dean. He wanted to be my friend, and he said to me, "Len, read everything I wrote on, read my book, Blind Ambition, Fairy Tale Number 2, and read my Senate testimony." So I took his Senate testimony, I took his book, I took everything else he wrote, and nothing matched. His Senate testimony said the opposite of what he wrote in his book, which told a totally different story. So I don't want to go into in depth because I think what I talked about today was more important in the long term. It's an interesting story. It involves prostitutes, the CIA, the mob, you name it. They're all involved in one way or another. There is a great book that you get next after Silent Coup. It's called White House Call Girl. In White House Call Girl, you'll see there's a story of a prostitute named Heidi Reichen who was part of the mob in D.C., Washington, D.C., and she also does a little work on the side for the Central Intelligence Agency. And her little black book is in White House Call Girl. And that little black book contains the name not just of John Dean and Mo Dean and John Dean's private phone number in the White House. Sam Dash, the Democrats' prosecutor on the Watergate Committee, is in that little black book with his unlisted phone number. Did John Dean trade sex in return? That's a question for future historians who care to go down the John Dean route to ask. Now, Senator Weicker from Connecticut is in there. Jeb Magruder is in there. Dixon aide, Haldeman aide. There are about 5 or 6, but basically it's a sports gambling operation. That's what she's running from the mob. And you'll see Sonny Jurgensen, and you'll see Billy Kilmer, quarterbacks for the Washington Redskins, Paul Hornung. You go down the list of famous NFL players, there's a few bettors amongst them, and I think Hornung was suspended for that. So there's a lot going on. Tried to highlight what was most important. So if you have questions, I'm available. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Do you have any comment on the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan?
No, and I have a kind of a rule. If I don't know, it's best if I don't say anything. You know, I've read what's in the newspaper, and I've read stories on it. I haven't studied it. Obviously, if he had died, it would have been another president out of office, and not Al Hay, but George H.W. Bush would have been president, which he eventually became president. So, no, I just don't go where I don't know, but thanks for the question.
Is there any truth to the fact that, or a rumor, of John Dean's wife being a call girl?
John Dean's wife is related, very close friends with Heidi Reichen, the girl whose little black book is in White House Call Girl. Maureen's name is in there, and her own phone number is in there. They were very close friends, and that's how John Dean met his wife, Mo Biner, at the time. Yes, she was part and parcel before she married John Dean, and that was part of the lawsuit. Because my dear friend Gordon Liddy, all of you remember Gordon Liddy, who kept silent for 5 years. If he only talked, the president would have been saved. Gordon didn't realize that till Silent Coup was written. And Gordon ran around the country calling Mo a prostitute and so on and so forth. And we all got sued. And strangely enough, Gordon got out of the suit clean. And then he got sued in Baltimore by his Dean's attorney getting another attorney to represent Ida Maxey Wells. There on the website, there's a thing called called the Key to Watergate. And the whole story is there. There is arrest made that night at the Watergate, and Carl Schaffler, the fellow who makes the arrest, takes a key around the neck of Martinez. Martinez is one of the burglars, and he's trying to... Now, this is what we know about Martinez today we didn't know 6 months ago. He was on the payroll of the CIA the day that he broke in, and while he was breaking in and whatever he did, he was getting paid by the agency. That key fit the desk where those pictures were, and one of the pictures was alleged to be Mo Dean.
Two quick questions. One was what is the first year where it starts counting the 40 Years' War. And then the other thing, I didn't hear you mention the name Bush during all this. And did he have any role?
Let me try and answer it in order. 40 years was from 2009 back. We are now in the 48th year of the war. So we have an introduction, an update in 40 Years' War that brings us up to date and talks about Iraq and so on and so forth, but it's all in 40 Years' War. And the Bushes are very key figures. I focused today on what I thought is the key to unlocking the mystery. Once you understand Woodward's role and Haig's role, you understand the reality, and then you can take it from administration to administration to see where they are and how they succeed. And clearly, in George W. Bush's administration, they won totally. It went totally against détente, totally against everything Nixon and Kennedy were for. And we ended up in Iraq, a country that didn't attack us. We invaded a sovereign country and killed their leader. That's what we did. And they want to know why we have a mess over there? And what bothers me is these candidates for president don't spend 15 minutes on the war. Oh, we'll bomb it, we'll do this. No, I want to know how you're going to get out. You've spent $6 trillion. How are you going to get out? But the same forces are still at work. Have been in Obama, continue to be at work, and I suspect will be really at work when the next president comes in. The neocons are in the fight.
Any more questions? Thank you, Lynn.
Gee,
very
look, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to take a lunch break here till 2 o'clock, and we'll be coming back with, excuse me, borrow your thing here. We've got a panel with George Norrie, and let me remind you, there's some